a ballot measure put forward on transit, which is something that is near and dear to our hearts. My name is Marnie Primer. I'm the chair of NAPTA, and I'll be moderating the session today. Next slide, please. You can see my Twitter handle. I will try and live tweet during the session, and of course, you're more than welcome to follow our speakers as well. Jason Jordan, the director of the Center for Transportation Excellence, one of the most knowledgeable folks on transit trends as it occurs in the political world. So he's going to be sharing what's on tap for 2015 and what we're seeing. Bill Scheel, who's a partner in Javelina and a former chief of staff for Mayor Gordon in the city of Phoenix. We also have Abby Albrecht, director of the Utah Transportation Coalition, which is a part of the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce. And she also led the Proposition 1 campaign to success. So we'll be starting with Jason today, and he'll be kicking off his presentation momentarily. Jason.
Thanks so much, Marnie. Appreciate the partnership with NAPTA and your role in leading the webinar today. I'm going to start by walking through all of the transit campaigns that we have seen this year. CFTE began monitoring these transit elections back in 2000, so we now have 15 consecutive years of campaigns to analyze and trends to monitor. So before I get into the individual campaigns of 2015, let me start with some overview statistics and observations. Of course, 2015 being an odd-numbered year, we don't have quite the same volume of elections that we would expect in even-numbered general election years, 2014, 2016, but we did have 34 different measures in 2015 specifically related to transit across the country. And so just so that everyone is clear, the initiatives that we're talking about here in this presentation are ones that have at least a significant component that is dedicated for public transportation, for transit. So the universe of all transportation measures is larger than this, but we're going to focus in specifically today on the 34 transit measures that occurred across 10 states that you can see reflected on the map here. I'll talk more about the nature of these measures as we go through, but as you can see from the legend of the map, the majority of the measures this year, as in past years, are either sales tax or property taxes, but we did have a few other fees and advisory measures and bond measures that occurred this year as well. So you can see here, breaking down the overall number of measures. This is not just on election day, this is across the entire year, that we had 23 victories, 23 successful campaigns, 9 campaigns that came up short, and we still have 2 races that are too close to call that are in the pending category. So if you pull out the races that have not yet been called, those 2, that puts our success rate for 2015 at just under 72%, rounding about 72% success rate. And you can see here on this slide how that measures up across the 15 years. One of the points that I always try to make when I'm talking about the work that we've done at CFTE looking at these campaigns is the really remarkable track record of success. 71% of the time across all 15 years, measures have been victorious at the ballot box. You can see that in recent years we have been right around or above the 70% margin. And just to put that in perspective, let me make a couple of observations. One is that political scientists who work on referendum ballot initiatives, who've done some studies, based on their data, these measures, these transit-focused measures, continue to pass at about twice the rate as the entire universe of ballot measures. So there really is something particularly compelling and successful around these measures when compared to the entire universe of what voters are asked to approve. Secondly, when you think about the times we live in terms of deep political polarization by ideology and by party, I think that casts even more important light on the fact that the overwhelming majority of the time these measures are successful. So they really do bring people together. People can coalesce around using their own tax dollars to support this kind of transportation and investment. And it is important to note that most of these measures, the overwhelming majority of all these measures, do involve taxes or dedicated fees of some sort. So we are talking about providing, direct tax dollars into these projects. So I think that, again, makes it even more interesting that the success rate has been so strong for so long. Now, I will make one other point here, and later on we can talk about some of the tactics and strategies around these campaigns, but it is important to note that while we have had this remarkable run of 70+% win rates for these campaigns, that when you break it down and you look at any individual campaign, very often the margin of victory is pretty narrow. And I think you see that reflected in the fact that here a week after the election, we still have two races that are too close to call. So one of the things that CFTE was set up to do is to try to understand what is the playbook for being successful at the ballot box of these measures, because while you're going to win most of the time, it doesn't mean it's necessarily an easy path. If you look at these two charts here, the total number of measures sort of broken down for comparison purposes, the off-cycle odd-numbered year races versus the even-numbered year races. I put this in here to make one important point, which is the 34 measures that we saw in 2015 is the largest number of measures that we have ever counted for an off-cycle election year. By a relatively decent number. 28 was our recent high in 2011, 34 in 2015. You can see the trend line when you look at the main cycle elections as well. This is clearly a growth area. That is, more communities are looking to the ballot as a viable tool for addressing their transportation investment challenges. And so while there have been some ups and downs, certainly, and the trend isn't enormous growth, the trend is toward fairly steady growth in the number of these measures. I mentioned before that we are primarily, overwhelmingly, in fact, talking about finance-related measures, funding-related measures when we're talking about transit ballot measures. This chart simply breaks down for 2015 only the nature of the different ballot measures, so the type of funding or the type of measure that was put to voters. And what you can see here, obviously, is that, again, the overwhelming majority either fall in the category of sales tax or property tax measure, slightly more this year in the sales tax category. But we did have 9% of the races were what might be considered advisory measures of one stripe or another. We had several measures that were related, and I'll go through some of these in more detail in a second, were related to non-sales or property tax related fees, levies, other sorts of taxes. It's not uncommon that we see a handful of bond measures and we see some measures related to the establishment of a regional transit authority of some stripe, or participation in or trying to get out of those structures. And while I didn't include the slide of all the pie chart of all the measures from 2000 to 2015, I can tell you that these statistics adhere pretty closely to what we have seen over the years. So let me turn to Election Day itself. I mentioned we had 34 measures in the course of all of calendar 2015, but on Election Day itself we had 16 measures across 6 different states. You can see those listed on the chart. And I should note too, for those of you who want more detailed information, our website at cft.org catalogs all of the various races that we've tracked and monitored, and you can get more detail on them. We were slightly ahead of our annual success rate on Election Day itself. Again, excluding the two that we can't yet declare victory or defeat in, you're looking at almost 80% of the ballot measures that went to voters on Election Day last week were successful. So let me just walk through the races, the Election Day races, in a little bit more detail. You can see on the slides where these occurred. I'll go state by state, and you can see the various win percentages here. Colorado is a state that has seen a growing number of these measures in recent years. Of course, Colorado helped kick off this trend in many respects with the very well-known successes in Denver for voter-approved transit investment. What you see here, start in Breckenridge, where voters approved a 4.5% tax on ski lift tickets to provide as much as $3.5 million annually for bus service, specifically bus service that serves the community, but also serves some of the resorts there in Breckenridge. In Fraser, Colorado, another victory. This was a 1% sales tax, again, to support local bus service. Winter Park, another ski community where residents approved a 2% sales tax increase, and the town of Winter Park will use those resources to take over operation of the bus service in the Winter Park Resort Shuttle. So sort of interesting in this state to see the application of transit investments in tourist-heavy communities. Shifting across the country to the East Coast, to the state of Maine, this was a statewide bond package, an $85 million bond package. $68 million of that total was provided for road improvements, other transportation infrastructure improvements, while $17 million was dedicated for transit investment in the state of Maine. And again, pretty resounding victory statewide, and that's something we've seen in the state of Maine as well as some of the other New England states. Transportation bond measures going to voters statewide and being successful. We had one in Rhode Island just a election cycle ago. Michigan is a perennial popular state for transportation related measures. There are many communities across the state of Michigan that regularly go for property tax levies and renewals, and so we had several of those here on Election Day, and even a greater number if you looked earlier in 2015. So just to touch on a few of these, in Flint, this was a renewal of a 0.6 millage property tax for the Flint Mass Transit Authority. In Delta County, it was a 5-year renewal, again, of a 0.6 millage property tax for the Delta Area Transit Authority for their operations. There was a township election that where voters decided in favor of a 10-year property tax of up to 0.36 mils, and this would expand Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority bus service to the township. And for those of you who follow ballot measures, you may recall that Ann Arbor itself had a significant victory recently, and this really continues a very strong track record of property tax related victories in the state of Michigan, where they've had a really astonishing record of success over recent years. Turning to Oregon, this was a measure that attracted a fair amount of controversy and went down to defeat, and this is one of those measures that I alluded to that's a different approach than the traditional sales or property tax. This was a payroll tax, 0.21% payroll tax designed to fund expanded bus service. They were trying to expand to include weekend and evening service. The other component of this particular measure was that local businesses would have been able to deduct the local payroll tax on their federal tax form. This one really split the business community there in Salem, Oregon, and went down to defeat. Utah, I'm not going to say too much about because we have the real expert on everything that went on in the state of Utah coming up later on the program. But I will just note here quickly that for all of these Utah counties that had a component for transit on the ballot, this was a part of a statewide package. If the county fell within the Utah Transit Authority service area, then 40% of the new sales tax revenue would go toward funding UTA services. It was a 0.25% sales tax. But again, we're going to hear much more about the details of all of these races. Very interesting races, and Utah, again, a state with a very rich history in transportation ballot measures, transit measures in particular. And this is one where we still have a too close to call for Salt Lake County, Utah. Washington State, again, this is a state with a fairly regular record of going to the voters, asking their support for transit. In Seattle, this was a property tax victory, a 9-year, $900 million property tax measure designed to replace a measure that passed back in 2006 called Bridging the Gap. That was sidewalk, complete streets focused measure, and so this was the replacement for that. And of course, Seattle is a community that has gone regularly to the ballot, and this is in some ways a preparatory measure for a campaign that's expected there in 2016. So we'll be keeping our eyes on the Puget Sound region again next year for races. And then our final race is in Washington as well. This is one where the pro-sales tax side was narrowly ahead, but we're waiting to see the final results of some of those pending ballots. This would have been a 0.3% sales tax increase, again, to provide transit service. So that's a roundup of all of the Election Day races in 2015. Again, if you want to go back and get more details and look at even some of the races that occurred earlier in 2015, those are available on the website. Probably the biggest election, the two biggest elections of the year, we're fortunate enough to have firsthand accounts on this webinar in Phoenix and Utah, so I'll leave it to my colleagues to talk more about those. But before I turn it over to talk about the Phoenix campaign, let me just take a moment to draw just a couple of observations from what we saw in 2015. First, as I mentioned, the growth continues, that the use of these ballot measures as critical funding devices has continued, and this has been a consistent story over the course of a number of years, but I think clearly even beyond the places where this has become pretty common to go to the voters, we're seeing more and more communities looking to their states to get the authority to go to the ballot, places that haven't had that tradition looking to use it because they've seen the success elsewhere. Secondly, and I know that you'll hear about this in the upcoming two presentations, but let me just make the point that there have always been professional critics of transit and professional organizations devoted to opposing these individual measures. But over the last 2 years in particular, we've seen a significant evolution in the funding tools at their disposal, their willingness to be engaged as a long-term player in communities, and a broader swath of institutions now becoming involved, that the sort of broader anti-tax movement around the country really is focusing on some of these very local races. And thirdly, many of these races have a larger context. We're seeing the state role continuing to grow. In many instances, that's because the locals need that state authority to go to the ballot, but we've seen a growing number of statewide measures, some very high-profile ones that went down to defeat in Missouri and in Michigan in recent years. So this larger context for the local campaign is something that we're seeing in more and more races. Fourthly, that there really is power in building on the success of existing service. I think you'll hear some about this in the Phoenix story, but being able to point to a system that is successful as a way of going back and either renewing or extending or increasing that local levy is something that we're seeing more of. So it's always hardest to get that first investment to begin the service. Once it's in place, we've seen places really be successful in renewing and increasing those in future years. We know from looking at these races that local champions, be they elected officials, business leaders, community leaders, but the champions of these initiatives can be really pivotal to their success or their failure. And the timing of these races, going when you have a good handle on who's going to show up at the ballot box and that the political climate is right for your measure, are things we've been talking about over the course of the 15 years we've been looking at these races. They remain vital today. And then the last thing I'll mention is that we really are seeing in many places much more of a permanent campaign apparatus in place, whether that be grassroots coalitions that are staying active on transit issues over the long haul, or other sorts of institutions like chambers of commerce and others building a pro-transportation investment infrastructure, if you will, for advocacy on behalf of these measures. And we're also seeing some of that on the other side. And many of the communities are building into their measures the notion that they'll be going back on a fairly regular basis to their voters. So that permanent campaign mentality is really taking hold, I think, in a lot of places where these aren't the sort of one-off elections that they might have been 10 years ago. So with that, let me turn it over to Bill to talk about the Phoenix story. Bill, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. A great overview of what's happening nationally, and I just want to take us through then our experience in Phoenix this past August. And so, as Jason alluded to, Phoenix passed a comprehensive transit tax in 2000, which allowed us to plan and build our light rail system as well as expand our bus system. And light rail opened in 2008, very successfully exceeded ridership forecasts almost immediately, and also has been a great generator for economic development along the line. So it really has been a resounding success. So we came to 2014 and had lots of plans for expansion, but we're starting to get stymied by the fact that the tax was set to expire in 2020, and so Mayor Stanton took a leadership role in accelerating a renewal vote so that we could assured funding into the future for future expansion. And let's see, it doesn't seem like my slideshow is working. There we go. We were brought in as private consultants to work with the city to develop the plan and then to take that to the voters. The first step was to determine what the goals were for the program, and city leaders, citizens, we went through a long public process and found that people really were focused on street issues, which hadn't been funded in our first vote, and so people wanted to see the condition of streets improved. People were very supportive of mobility choices, as for handicap folks and people without access to cars, and people really wanted to see the economic benefits of light rail spread throughout the city. And so Mayor Stanton, in the run-up, decided to instigate a really broad-based planning process, which was really key to our success. So we had a 35-member panel that started the planning process early on. And if we can go to the next slide. That process started in August of 2014. The group held more than 100 meetings and events. It was led by former U.S. Secretary of Transportation Mary Peters, who came out of Arizona and was provided a tremendous amount of credibility to the process. We had a huge online presence that allowed thousands of people to engage both through a online planning process and comments on the plan as it evolved. And then the next slide talks about the how important the preparation for these types of efforts are. So, and in Phoenix, we did start early to ensure that the community understood the needs. We had this broad-based community-driven process that I just described. We made sure that all significant parts of the community were involved, including the business community, the construction industry, the users, the disability community, really got everyone involved. And then also we made sure that there was a healthy dose of political realism. Through the process, a massive wish list was developed and became much too rich for the elected officials who needed to put this on the ballot, but that gave them an opportunity to prioritize projects and scale back. But what that, after that process, we came up with a plan that basically made sure that every street in the city would get an overlay over the next 30 years. We had had a cycle of, because of cutbacks in state highway funding, our major streets were only going to be overlaid once every 75 to 90 years. That has now been reduced to 25 to 30 years, prolonging all our city streets. We, as part of that process, we made sure that our bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure would be improved with over 1,000 miles of bike lanes and new sidewalks. Implementing our comprehensive bicycle master plan, our complete streets program, shade programs, and really making this a true multimodal proposition. We laid out a specific map that has where our light rail extensions will be in on our slide. That the orange is our existing light rail line, the purple will be our light rail extensions, and then the blue lines are future bus rapid transit corridors, so making sure that virtually every part of the city is touched. And then we proposed and sold a very large expansion of new and improved bus service, so that all neighborhoods built since 2000, which hadn't had any bus service at all, will now have bus service, and all major lines will have increased peak hour service, and we are now matching our bus service to light rail, so any bus line that crosses any bus line that crosses the light rail line will have service hours that run as late as light rail. And that gets us, I need to go forward on our slides, and one more. So that ended up meaning that we had a, if you could back me up about 3 slides there. One more slide right there. That's our expanded bus service, and then the next slide shows how that broke down. So we ended up proposing and taking to the ballot a 0.7% tax. That was an increase of the existing 0.4 tax, so we had a significant tax increase. That, though really computed on a monthly basis for the average Phoenix resident, is about $4 to $5 a month. And really importantly, it leveraged over $14 billion in federal, other local funds, rider fares, etc. The good news on this was that we had lots of different funding sources. What made it a little bit of a challenge was the opponents were able to go after this as a $31 billion package, which was an easy target for them. We looked at the increased sales tax was about $7 billion and was really nicely divided among all three modes of transportation, and that was an important selling part for us, that the bus service, increased bus service will be about 50% of the new tax revenues. The street improvements were a full 1/3 of the new dollars, and light rail only constituted about 17% of that expense. But as we'll discuss a little bit later, it became the focal point of the opposition. We had a vigorous campaign after that strong preparation. We targeted, our polling indicated that one of our best messages was education, the way light rail currently connects the ASU downtown campus to ASU Tempe, and it basically serves as the main transportation system for our largest high school district in the city. And so selling this as a way to help our students was a really important part of our plan. But we did the same type of campaign with targeting services for lower income populations, the disabled community, the elderly, really making sure that every part of the community understood the benefits to them. This is a piece of mail that shows the type of mail campaign we did throughout. And the next slide gives a little overview of the entire campaign. We worked hard to develop a really solid list of supporters from all parts of the community. One of the things our polling told us is that we couldn't rely only on our political leaders as endorsers. We needed to have regular people and users supporting our initiative. We did 12 citywide mailings, as you saw one of those examples. We did extensive paid canvassing in our neighborhoods where we knew support would be strong to get our vote out. We had a small cable TV buy just to make sure that all voters had some exposure. We did extensive social media advertising with Facebook and Twitter, and all in all we raised and spent about $1.1 million, which for a City of Phoenix campaign is a moderate size campaign, not really large at all. We spent more than that in 2006 on a city bond campaign. So in the 10-year stretch, our campaign spending really didn't increase much at all. As Jason alluded to, we did have opposition in this campaign. The Americans for Prosperity, a national Koch brothers funded outfit out of Arlington, Virginia, did a couple pieces of mail. They focused, as you can see from this first piece here, on the what they called an alleged $30 billion blank check for City Hall as a reason to vote no. And then they also focused on light rail as a mode of transportation that only 1% of our residents would use and would not be a benefit to the majority of our residents. So that was the thread of opposition that we had to face throughout the campaign. And as you can see here, that campaign was based pretty much out of Arlington, Virginia. There was a local chapter of AFP here in Phoenix that did help organize, and there was one city council member who led the opposition. Fortunately for us, there really wasn't any coalition of opponents. So we had one city council member, a small one-person AFP local shop, and then the national money. The next slide outlines what that campaign actually consisted of. They did 2 citywide mailings. They did some canvassing in the one council district, which was a key one for us. We ended up winning that district. They had a web page, and they were active on Twitter, and they spent about $100,000. And one of the tricky things about these AFP operations is they are running it through a 501c4 campaign, so they are not required to file campaign reports. So we actually will never know how much money they actually spent on this campaign. So how did the campaign end up? We ended up with almost a 10% victory, almost 13,000 votes, with a relatively low turnout in an August election. But we felt very happy about that. But Jason, some of the lessons Jason laid out were very important here. We needed to start early. We needed to have a good list of validators. We needed to really focus on good research to figure out what voters were looking for. We needed to focus on the successes of our existing system without making this a referendum on the transit agencies. So our campaign was quite separate from the agencies that are actually going to be operating the system. And so that, I think, concludes our presentation.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Bill. Before we get to our final presenter, I wanted to let participants know that you are able to ask questions. If you look at your GoToWebinar control panel, there's a tab marked questions. Just click on that tab and a field will open up where you can type your question in. As we get questions, I will be moderating a little Q&A session after we have our final presentation from Abby. Thank you so much, Bill. That was very interesting. Abby, I'll turn it over to you at this time.
Well, great. Thanks, Marnie. As she said earlier, I'm Abby Albrecht. I'm the director of the Utah Transportation Coalition in Salt Lake City. We're housed under the Salt Lake Chamber. And in the 2015 legislative session, I don't know if I have control over this. Yep, I do. Okay. In the 2015 legislative session, the legislature passed the most comprehensive transportation legislation probably in the last couple decades. It was the first time really in state history that we had a comprehensive plan. We hadn't passed a gas tax since 1997, so we were really pushing on that. And then we had a lot of local needs, and that turned into the 0.25 sales tax option that I'll be discussing in more detail today. It was a collaborative effort. It was the first time really in decades that all of the organizations that had interest in transportation kind of coalesced together to have one unified voice on the need for transportation, and really that's why it got over the finish line. Literally in the 11th hour on the last day of the session, so 11:49 p.m. And the session ended at midnight. So that gave the authority, the gas tax. Let me go through that really quickly, and I know this has nothing to do with transit, but I want to give you the full context of what happened. So it'll go into effect on January 1st. It converts our sales tax into, or our gas tax into a percentage per gallon. It's a tax on the wholesale. So essentially we'll get a 5-cent increase right off the bat on January 1st, and then that will grow over time as the price of fuel grows. So there's a floor and a ceiling to keep it within in constraints, and we will never go below that additional 5 cents, and we will never go above a total of 40 cents until the legislature takes action. And that was about $24 average per driver. And I wanted to tell you this because it added complexity to our ballot that we took to the public as we move forward. So the local option, and this was the second half of the bill, allowed counties, and we have 29 counties in the state of Utah, to put a 1/4 cent sales tax on the ballot. So it's equivalent to about 1 penny for every $4 spent in sales tax. In counties with transit, the division was 40% would go to cities and towns, 40% would go to transit, and 20% to the county. So essentially 60% to the cities and counties for road improvements, bikes, lanes, sidewalk improvements, and then 40% in the majority of the state of Utah would go to our transit agency, UTA. In some counties, they actually have independent transit districts, so that that 40% would go to that independent transit service district. And then in counties that didn't have transit, you can see the division, that 40% would then just fall to the counties. And again, it gave local municipalities the ability to fund roads, sidewalks, bike lanes, trails, and transit. Now, specific to transit, the board at UTA, at our Utah Transit Authority, passed a resolution that ensured that the money passed from this local option would go to bus service. So increasing of late night, early mornings, weekends, holidays, so specifically to bus. We don't have, I mean, there's rail projects that are out there, but the percentage of this money was so low that they just thought that this was a great spot for bus service to actually put into play. So what happened is the legislative session finished in March, into March, and the counties had to, if they were going to put it on the ballot in 2015, they had to do so by mid-August. We ended up with 17 of the 29 counties put it on the ballot, and we were asked, my organization was asked to run the statewide campaign because, of course, as you all know on this call, public money could not be used for a ballot measure, and so private money had to really come into play. So the business community was asked to step up and run the campaign. So we did that. It was the biggest undertaking that we've ever experienced, and as far as what we researched, having to do this in 17 counties on this complexity was a big undertaking. And it was even more complex because we had rural counties and we had urban counties, and then we had transit in some counties and not transit in some counties, and what was important to some counties was not necessarily important to others. And so just balancing all that was a real challenge. And we did have a lot of partnership in many from the business community. I don't have this on a slide, but I'll just talk about it. We had a relationship with Parsons Brinkerhoff, who helped us develop an app and a map on our website. And that was really helpful because we could actually show the general public what they were going to be receiving from the implementation of this tax. So the new bus routes, the new lines, the new increase in service. And then the hard part is really hard to articulate is the road and sidewalk improvements, because those are going to change from year to year as communities, check those off the list. They're going to change. So we're not always going to pave Main Street in downtown. So having to articulate that was an interesting battle. Let's see if I can go over here. So kind of a campaign overview. We had 23 billboards statewide. We have one media market here in the state of Utah, so that makes it really efficient, cost-effective. We had 5 TV stations that we broadcasted on, 4 radio stations. Social media, as Bill talked about in Phoenix, we had a ton of social media. So on Facebook and Twitter, you can see a picture off there. We filled potholes with a number of interesting things to kind of articulate and communicate what this meant. Lot of pieces. The website, we did the typical campaign: TV, radio, online, social media. The app had 12,000 views, as you can see, so that was really crucial to the overall campaign. We really only had 60 days. And so from the time it went on the ballot in August to November 3rd, we had to raise funds and we had to run the campaign in those 60 days. So I wish I had more time. I wish that we could have done the education process a little bit better, but we really essentially had to just ramrod our information into the general public and hope it stuck. We did, we direct mailed to about 200,000 people across those 17 counties. The Wasatch Front counties, which are our 4 main counties that has the transit district in it, were a lot of our emphasis because it was the multimodal component, and that's where most of our population sits. So here's a map of the state of Utah. You can see the green counties were the counties that passed the ballot measure. So we had 10 counties that passed the ballot measure, and Jason kind of gave you the stats on those earlier. We had 6 that did not pass, and then 1 that's still to be determined. It was the first time that the counties, in most cases, statewide, but specifically speaking about Salt Lake County, it was the first time that they had done a countywide mail-in ballot. So added some complexity to the counting, and there's 24,000, almost 25,000 ballots that were dropped off the last day, and state law requires them to hold the final election results for 2 weeks after the election. So we are currently behind by about 2,600 votes in Salt Lake County, and with 24,000 to be counted. So we're still holding our breath. It is going to be, that equivocates to about 54% that we need to lean our way with the remaining 24,000. But it's not dead yet. There's still hope for that. That is where the majority of our funding sits in Salt Lake County. That's where a dense amount of our population is. It's our capital city and a lot of our major cities in there. You can see, if you look, the county right above Salt Lake, the one in yellow, is Davis County, and then right above that is Weber, and those 2 areas have a high volume of transit. They both passed it. Remarkably, going into before anybody put it on the ballot, we did polling. The Davis County polling was suspect, to say the least. It was so we were very pleased when that passed, and it passed pretty handedly. It also had a school bond that was on the ballot as well. So In some people's cases, they only received either the school bond and this sales tax measure. The county to the south of Salt Lake County is Utah County, and that is another UTA service district. That did not pass it. We knew that going into it. The polling was rather poor going into it, but the county officials elected to put it on the ballot because they didn't want to get left behind by the campaign that was, essentially running in the other three Wasatch Front counties. Frankly, I think that deterred from us because we had a lot of detractors in Utah County, and I think that hurt us overall. But at least it brought some awareness to some of their citizens. It passed. All right, it failed, not by the margin that we thought it was going to fail, but nevertheless, it did end up failing. In the next slide here, you're going to see kind of the breakdown of the dollar amounts that were raised, that potentially would have been raised, or I guess would have been raised. And again, that Salt Lake County number is still to be determined. It's an unofficial estimate right there. There is transit now in Carbon County and Duchesne and Grand County. They have a service district, and they're working that out within their county. It's not a UTA service district, but they have a few lines of bus service that some of this money will go to in some of those rural counties. As Bill spoke about earlier about the Phoenix example, we did have deterrence. We had Americans for Prosperity. They have a local chapter here. They've been at a local chapter for about eight or 9 months. They put a lot of time and effort into Salt Lake and Utah County. They've made about 20,000 phone calls throughout in those two counties. They did mailers. They had a heavy presence in both social media, both Twitter and Facebook. Legally in the state of Utah, you do have to report all of your expenditures. And so, of course, as our campaign, we've reported all of our expenditures. And as in any ballot measure like this across the country, you're going to have construction firms, engineering firms, bus manufacturers, rail manufacturers that are going to fund your campaign. We did have a slew of the broad-based business community that funded, but we got pulled through the rails, I guess, so to speak, for having it so one-sided, and that was really from Americans for Prosperity. They did get in Utah County. They did get they gained relationships with some of our local elected officials, which did not help the cause, hurt us in that sense. Bill said this in the Phoenix example. We really don't know how much they spent. They're not because they're set up as their foundation. They do not report their donors, and so that's unfortunate. It's not really a fair playing field when one side is having to report and go through the checks and balances and the other side isn't. So that was unfortunate. The thing that I should know about this authorization on the local option is it's indefinite. So counties that failed can come back next year or the following year or in 5 years and put it back on the ballot. The counties that did not put it on the ballot in 2015 can do the same thing. There's no sunset, so this is indefinite. The counties that passed it will have this indefinitely, and then the counties that, like I said, the counties that didn't pass it have an opportunity to go back in and pass it in future years. So that's all that I had, Jason and Marty, and I'll take any questions if anyone has any.
Terrific. Well, I think we had some great presentations. We don't have any questions yet. I'll give people a couple of minutes to enter a question in. While they're doing that, I think, maybe the question I could start the conversation off with would be, was there anything, Bill or Abby, that surprised you in running your campaign? Was there something that, you know, in a good or a bad way, that kind of was different than what you expected out of the gate?
I guess for us here, I mean, Jason said this earlier in the conversation. We've had a great track record of passing these measures. In 2006, we passed a big one in 2000, and we didn't have any detractors. We had full support. So having Americans for Prosperity and the gamesmanship, I guess, so to speak, that they were playing was an interesting lesson to learn from our end. It's just not something that we were used to. It's not something we expected, and I wish we had learned from other areas about what their experience was with them going into it.
Yes, and I think for me here in Phoenix, what was surprising was I showed you that graphic that showed that only 17% of our tax increase was going to light rail. Yet light rail became the overwhelming focus of the campaign, both to the detractors and even to our supporters who constantly wanted to talk about light rail, even though we wanted to get more of the focus on the street improvements and the bus improvements. And so we were trying to present a very well-balanced package, but the conventional wisdom by the end of the campaign was that the campaign was all about light rail. And we were still successful, but I think I underestimated the difficulty in staying on our message of a balanced package.
Terrific. So we have had some questions come in. And so we have a question for Bill. Bill, could you share with us where some of your funding came from?
I would just echo what Abby said. We had very strong support from the construction industry that would be building the light rail system, from our vendors, the operators for both light rail and the bus service, other contractors, and to some extent kind of the usual business leaders in the community, although I will say as our banks and other big businesses have nationalized, we have fewer CEOs in Phoenix, and so it's harder to raise money from those folks who typically have supported these types of measures in the past.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions and only a couple more minutes, so we'll try and keep them quick. By the way, a PowerPoint presentation will be available on the CFTE website post-webinar, so if you wanted some of that great information shared by Bill or Abby or Jason, you're more than welcome to visit CFTE for that. Bill, Abby, can you tell me, were your elections mail-in elections? Did you have absentee voters?
Go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say, in Phoenix, you have the option of mail-in or vote at the polls, but in these relatively low turnout municipal elections, over 90% of our voters were mail-in. And so our get out the vote started 26 days before August 26th. So on August 1st, we were working very hard to get our ballots in. And it certainly changes the dynamic of a campaign when you have that many votes coming early.
Yeah, absolutely. So ours were a mixed bag. The 17 counties, for the most part, were mail-in ballot, although complexity-wise, we had some counties that were split, some counties that had, just a few cities that were mail-in ballots. So that added a lot of complexity to the campaign. So we essentially had to run two campaigns. We had to run a mail-in ballot campaign, and we had to run a traditional go-to-the-ballot box campaign.
Okay.
Many of our areas actually did the traditional go to the ballot box, even though they were given the vote by mail option. So it was interesting.
So, and I guess the last question that we have time for today is for Bill. Bill, if your public transit organization is the main proponent and the advocacy group is the face of the campaign, do you have any recommendations for making the vote not a referendum on the agency? How did you go about doing that?
The way we did that is by having other validators. So again, our validators were the business leaders. They were transit advocates as opposed to the transit officials. They were the users of the transit system. And the transit organization was there to answer technical questions about the plan, but was very much in the background as far as the campaign went, and that was a very deliberate strategy on our part. And we had the advantage we had is we haven't had major scandals, cost overruns. We were able to talk about the system being done on time and on budget, so that clearly was an advantage for us. I think if you've got performance issues with your agency, that's going to make it a lot harder.
Well, the promises made, promises kept message is always a strong one when you're going out to the ballot. So if you have a good transit agency, that's always very helpful, and one that has a track record of taking good care of public dollars. I'd like to ask if any of our panelists have any closing thoughts, and then I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Jason, do you have anything you'd like to add in closing?
Well, the only thing I would add is my word of thanks to the other presenters and to you, Marnie, and all the folks at NAPTA for partnering with us in this webinar series, to our main supporters at the American Public Transportation Association who provide the support for our work. We appreciate their efforts. And I think you see on the slide that this is the first of a 6-part series. They're all free. We hope you will make plans to join us for future webinars.
Terrific. Abby, Bill, any last thoughts?
I would just say, again, thanks for joining the webinar. We are here to share information about winning strategies, so feel free to contact us, and we are here to help you win.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone has any questions out there and lessons learned, happy to answer any questions.
Terrific. And again, the PowerPoint presentation will be available on the CFTE website. The next webinar will be March 8th, Building Support and Combating Critics. The websites are going to be up on the final slide for your use. And thank you again for joining us today. Take care.